carelessness. What pressure now on Mr Johnson?
Well, good morning, Nick. Of course, I'm very disappointed, both for those great Conservative councillors who've lost their seats after years of public service, but also for the residents of those areas, because by and large, they've had great track records. If you look at Wandsworth, they've kept council tax the lowest in the country. There's a £900 difference between council tax in Wandsworth and Merton. But it's also
a bit academic now, Mr Jenrick, isn't it, in fairness?
Well, I hope that the residents of those areas don't suffer as a result of this with high tax Labour councils. But it's fair to say that those councils, particularly Wandsworth and Barnet, were hanging by a thread for some time. There were only 200 votes between Conservatives and Labour in Wandsworth in 2018. So it's not entirely surprising, although very disappointing, that it would change hands right now. So I would caution you, Nick, into reading too much into what the consequences are that for the
London is a
wider
wasteland,
political
Mr.
picture.
Jenrick. This for a Prime Minister who seemed to achieve the unachievable, to be voted the Conservative Mayor of London, not once but twice. Now, as he sets foot out of his office at number 10, he moves into Labour territory. This is unheard of. Westminster has been Conservative since 1964. How much pressure on Mr Johnson that he has to go?
Well, you have to look at the broader political picture, and I don't see any particular love or seismic progress for the Labour Party in these results. If you look in the Midlands and the North, where the vast majority of the most marginal parliamentary constituencies are, as of a few minutes ago, the Labour Party were actually going backwards, and the Conservative Party were doing reasonably well, pretty respectable for a midterm set of elections.
Try and present this as a success for the Conservative Party. You're not seriously asking my listeners to believe that, are you?
Well, I think, Nick, someone as a seasoned political commentator like you would want to present this as, I think, a mixed set of results. It's very disappointing for us in London.
Right.
I don't think the same is true in the Midlands and the North, where there's quite a mixed picture, and there's no sense, as far as I can see, that the Labour Party are making the kind of progress that you would expect if they were hoping to win the next general election.
I appreciate West Oxford isn't quite in the Midlands, but it's sort of north of their own counties. You've lost that, or not you personally. The party's lost that after 22 years. This was David Cameron's knocking ground. So you've got one Prime Minister who doesn't even have the borough in which he lives, and you've got a former Prime Minister now, and that's gone to Labour as well. The game's up, isn't it?
No, I don't think that's right. I mean, if you look at midterm elections,
Sevenoaks will be next.
It is normal for a sitting government, particularly one that's been in office for 12 years, to be facing a difficult scene. We actually went into these elections as the largest party of local government, with 40% of all of the local councillors in the country being Conservatives, and Labour only having around 20%. The Labour Party, if they really want to win the next election, need to flip that over entirely. When Tony Blair was in opposition in 1995, 2 years out from an election, he was winning 1,800 council seats. So I think you've got to put this in some kind of perspective. It's very disappointing. There are lessons to be learnt from it, but it doesn't feel to me to be the seismic change that some had predicted, or certainly the Labour Party were hoping for.
One other area to explore, if you would, Mr Jenrick, reminding my listeners, of course, you served as a Treasury Minister not that long ago. You will have seen the figures. You will have heard the Governor of the Bank of England. Interest rates are going up. Inflation is going up. GDP is going down. The value of the pound has gone down. The average family, £1,200 wiped off their incomes. Come on, we have to hear something from your colleague Rishi Sunak. We have to have some kind of tax cuts or whatever it might be. What are the policies that you'd be pushing for?
Well, I think that the first thing is that the Bank of England now need to take decisive action. I think they've mishandled this. They underestimated inflation. They are now starting to increase interest rates. That's a hard decision because that obviously hits household budgets for those people with mortgages. But that is important that they take action and they cut back on quantitative easing, which has fueled inflation over recent years. The Chancellor has set out a package of measures, £9 billion worth. I know he will be returning to that at the end of the summer, which is when we will know when how much the energy price cap is going to rise. So that's the important moment at which he needs to calculate how much support he needs to put in place to help families, households, and particularly the most vulnerable in society. And I think we have, as a government, to do no harm, no more increases in taxes, and a real effort across government to ensure that the cost of living is at the forefront of every policy decision from now on. For the next year or two, it's going to be very difficult for households right across the country. The government's singular focus must be, and I'm sure it will be now, on trying to ease that as much as one can. There are no simple solutions, though, remember. This is an international issue fueled by pent-up demand from the pandemic, fueled by the geopolitical situation that we now see in Europe. But we will be focusing on this relentlessly, I'm sure.
And do you avail yourself of supermarket-owned brand products, Mr. Jenrick?
Yeah, I do sometimes. Yeah, absolutely.
All right.
I think we all do, don't we? I mean, it would be foolish not to.
What was the last Superman brand product you bought then?
Well, I was in Asda in Newark about 5 hours ago shopping, and so bought stuff there and then drove down to London to start doing these interviews. So
Asda in Newark was open at 2 in the morning. Is it a 24-hour Asda in Newark then? That was open at 2 a.m.?
You picked me up correctly. I was there at about 5 o'clock today. So I have been up all night doing these interviews, so you have to forgive me.
5 o'clock last night, you mean you were doing the shop?
I've slightly lost track of time,
all right.
but Asda in Newark is 24 hours.
Well, I'm sure
in case any of your listeners want to pop into the great town of Newark.
I'm sure other supermarkets are available in the great town of Newark. Robert Jenrick, of course, is the MP there, former Housing Secretary, appearing on LBC 4 after 7. Let's get the headlines.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's news.